The first time I woke up to find Shadow sitting at the window, I thought it was nothing, maybe a fox in the yard, or the crunch of a falling branch. But by the fourth night, I realized something was wrong. He wasn't just looking. He was guarding. His ears were pricked, his breathing slow and steady, and his eyes weren't following Shadow's. They were fixed on something, someone, in the darkness. It had started snowing again before sunset, the flakes heavy and wet, clinging to the bare branches of the oak outside my house. By the time I finished my last cup of tea and switched off the living room light, the world outside had gone quiet, that strange, heavy quiet that only comes when snow is falling thick. I'd barely been in the house 2 weeks. A new town, a new street where everyone seemed to wave politely but never linger long enough for conversation. The place had come with a history, too. The realtor had avoided my eyes when she mentioned that the previous owner had left in a hurry. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Shadow was the only familiar thing I'd brought here. I'd adopted him from the unit 6 months earlier, when his handler, a soldier I'd met while volunteering at the shelter, told me Shadow needed a home. He's not a pet, the soldier had warned. He's a protector. He'll do the job whether you ask him to or not. I thought it was a figure of speech. That night, after brushing my teeth, I turned off the hallway light and stepped into my bedroom. The lamp on the nightstand was still on, casting a warm circle of light over the bed. Shadow was already inside, sitting stiffly at the window. His posture was so rigid it stopped me mid-step. "What is it?" I asked quietly. He didn't move. Didn't flick an ear. His gaze was fixed outside, unblinking. I crossed the room and stood behind him, peering into the yard. Snow was drifting down in slow, lazy spirals. The porch light lit up the first few meters of the lawn, but beyond that, the world was just darkness. "Probably nothing," I murmured, though my voice sounded too soft, even to me. Shadow's ears twitched once, then went still again. I touched his side gently, trying to coax him toward the bed, but he resisted, not with aggression, just with stubborn weight. He wasn't moving from that spot. "All right," I sighed. "You keep watch." I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. I told myself he was reacting to the snow, to the flicker of shadows when the wind shifted. I even closed my eyes, determined not to feed into the tension humming in the room. But minutes turned into hours, and every time I opened my eyes, he was still there, a dark silhouette against the pale curtain, his breath fogging the glass. It was near midnight when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the house or the wind. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Footsteps. I held my breath. My eyes flicked to Shadow. He hadn't moved, but his body was vibrating with a low, contained energy. His tail was down, his ears forward. I slid silently from the bed and crept to the window. The cold glass stung my fingertips as I pulled the curtain back a fraction of an inch. At first, I saw nothing, just the snow falling through the porch light. Then, at the very edge of the yard, where the darkness swallowed the light, a shadow shifted. It was the shape of a man. Tall. Still. Facing the house. My pulse thudded in my ears. I couldn't make out his face, not with the snow and distance, but I knew he was looking straight at my window. Shadow let out a sound then, not a bark, not even a growl. It was deeper, almost a rumble, like something building in his chest. The figure didn't move. He didn't approach. He just stood there. I reached for my phone with shaking hands, dialing the local sheriff's number. The dispatcher promised to send someone out, her voice calm and efficient, but the whole time I kept glancing back at the window. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The sheriff's car arrived 20 minutes later, tires crunching over the snow. They swept the yard, checked the tree line, found nothing but the prints, a single line of them leading from the road to the spot outside my window, and then back again. Could be a prank, the deputy offered, but his tone said he didn't believe it any more than I did. After they left, I locked every door and window, though it felt meaningless. The house was old, and if someone wanted in badly enough, they'd find a way. Shadow stayed at the window until dawn. He didn't sleep once. And I lay there, wide awake, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, wondering if the soldier had been right. Maybe he wasn't a pet. Maybe he was the only thing between me and whoever was out there. Open. The next morning, the yard looked untouched except for those footprints. I stood at the window with my coffee, tracing their path again and again with my eyes. They started at the road, cut straight across the snow, stopped at my window, and turned back the exact same way. No wandering, no hesitation, whoever it was had known exactly where they were going. Shadow lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes followed my every movement. He hadn't been restless once I was up, but it was the kind of stillness that felt alert. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was an isolated thing. Maybe some drunk wandered off the road. Maybe a hunter had taken the wrong trail. But the questions kept circling. Why stop at my window? And why stand there long enough to leave that much unease behind? By mid-afternoon, I decided to make some changes. I moved the heavy dresser in front of the bedroom window, not enough to block it completely, but enough to give me some comfort. Then I walked the perimeter of the house, checking every lock, every latch. Shadow followed me everywhere. When night came, I kept all the lights off in the back of the house. The front porch light stayed on, but that was it. I figured if the yard was dark, I'd see movement easier. By 9 p.m., I was in bed with a book, Shadow stretched along the rug beside me. It was quieter than the night before, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing seem loud. At 11:17, he stood up. No sound. No warning. Just up, alert, head turned toward the window. I froze. He moved to the glass and sat, the same posture as the night before, rigid, motionless, focused. The dresser blocked my view this time, but that didn't matter. My heart was already pounding because I knew, deep down, someone was out there again. I slid from the bed, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and edged to the side of the window. My fingers brushed the curtain, pulling it back just enough to see outside. Snow had stopped falling hours ago, and the air was so clear the moonlight lit up the entire yard. And there he was. Closer than before. Not at the tree line this time, but halfway between the road and my porch, standing in the middle of the yard like he belonged there. My breath caught in my throat. Even from here, I could make out more detail, a dark jacket, hands shoved deep in the pockets, head tilted slightly upward like he was looking straight into the window. His face was still in shadow, but the intent in his stance was unmistakable. Shadow's tail was down, his body taut. The growl started low again, vibrating through the room. The man didn't flinch. I reached for my phone but stopped. Last night had brought the sheriff, the footprints, and no answers. Tonight, I wanted to know how far this would go. I switched off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. My eyes adjusted quickly, and I moved to the far corner, watching him through the narrow opening in the curtain. He didn't move for a full 2 minutes. Then, slowly, deliberately, he took a single step forward. Shadow stood instantly. The growl deepened, his entire body angled toward the glass. The man stopped. The stillness that followed was unbearable. My heartbeat was loud enough I was afraid he could hear it. Then, just as slowly as he'd approached, he stepped back, turned, and walked toward the road. His pace was unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. I didn't breathe until he disappeared into the darkness. Shadow didn't leave the window until almost dawn. Even when I dozed off for brief moments, I'd wake to the faint sound of his claws shifting against the wood floor, his gaze still locked outside. By morning, the prints in the snow told the same story. He'd come closer, stopped, and then left the same way he came. It was becoming clear this wasn't random. He was testing something. Testing me. I stood on the porch with Shadow beside me, staring at the yard. The day was bright, the kind of deceptive calm that makes you wonder if you'd imagine the whole thing. but the heaviness in my chest told me I hadn't. That night, I decided to stay awake. I made coffee late, turned the living room lights low, and sat in the armchair where I could see the yard without being obvious. Shadow sat beside me, his ears twitching at every creak of the house. It was near midnight when I saw movement at the far edge of the yard. The man appeared between two trees, standing perfectly still. Only this time, he wasn't alone. There was another shape, smaller, hunched, keeping close behind him. My mouth went dry. Shadow stiffened. His eyes locked on the figures, and I knew whatever this was, it was shifting into something else entirely. The second figure stayed in the shadows, half concealed by the trees. They didn't move, didn't speak. Only the man in the dark jacket stood in the open, his body angled toward my house as if nothing about this was unusual. I kept my hand on the phone in my lap, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could call now. I could bring the sheriff out again. But some part of me, the same part that had stopped me the night before, wanted to understand first. Shadow had moved closer to the window, his stance low, weight balanced, ready. His breathing was slow but steady, the way I imagined it had been on the field during deployments. The faint rumble in his chest was constant now. The man lifted his head, just slightly, and I saw the porch light catch the edge of his jaw. Pale skin. Stubble. The glint of something reflective in his eye, or maybe just the frost in the air. He took one step forward. The smaller figure didn't follow. Shadow's growl deepened, and I caught the faint movement of his hackles rising along his back. I could feel his tension like static in the room. Another step. Now the man was only a dozen yards from the porch. He stopped there, looking straight into the window like he knew exactly where I sat. My grip on the phone tightened. The temptation to turn on the lamp, to confront him head-on, was almost overwhelming. But I stayed still. And then something unexpected happened. The second figure stepped out from behind the trees. It was a child. Small, bundled in a too-large coat, a wool hat pulled down low over their head. The light barely reached them, but I could see their hands, bare, red from the cold. My stomach turned. The child didn't approach the man. They didn't approach the house either. They just stood there, head tilted slightly, as if waiting for something. The man glanced back at them, then returned his gaze to my window. The stillness between them was unnerving, like there was some silent conversation I wasn't part of. I finally raised the phone, my finger ready to hit call. That was when Shadow moved. He left the window in a sudden, deliberate motion, pacing quickly to the front door. He stood there, head high, body taut, as if daring the man to come closer. The man didn't move. I flicked the porch light off, plunging the yard into shadow. For a second, neither figure was visible. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw their faint outlines again, retreating. First the man, slow and deliberate. Then the child, keeping a careful distance behind. They disappeared into the darkness the way they'd come. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The rest of the night, Shadow returned to his post at the window. I didn't sleep. Every noise outside, every faint creak of the old house, set my nerves on edge. By morning, the prints in the snow told the story clearly, 2 sets this time. One large, one small, both approaching and retreating in the same narrow path. I walked the yard with Shadow at my side, following the trail until it merged with the road. No tire marks. No other footprints. It was the sheriff's day off, but I left a message on the station's line, telling them what had happened. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop replaying the image of the child in my head. They hadn't looked scared. They hadn't looked cold either, though the air had been sharp enough to sting my lungs. And the way the man had looked at them, it wasn't protective. It was expectant. That night, I tried something different. I kept the porch light off entirely and the living room light low, sitting in the same armchair with Shadow beside me. My phone was charged, the nearest flashlight within reach, and I had placed a heavy kitchen knife on the table just in case. Midnight came and went with no movement. It was 1:03 a.m. when Shadow's ears twitched. He stood slowly, padding to the window with silent precision. I followed his gaze. At first, I saw nothing. Then a faint shift at the far edge of the yard, the man again, standing alone this time. But something was different. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at the window, behind me. My blood ran cold. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkened glass of the back door across the room. There, a small silhouette pressed close to the glass. Too small to be the man. It was the child. Shadow moved so fast I barely registered it. He crossed the room in 3 strides, planting himself between the back door and me, his teeth bared, a low snarl cutting through the silence. The child didn't move away. They just stood there, head tilted, eyes locked on mine through the glass. For a long, tense moment, neither of us moved. The glass between us seemed thinner than it had any right to feel. The child's breath fogged the pain in faint bursts, their eyes locked unblinking on mine. Even with the darkness outside, I could make out a pale face beneath the wool hat, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. No expression. No fear. Shadow's growl vibrated through the floorboards, a steady warning that I felt in my ribs. His stance was a shield, head low, body angled forward, tail stiff, but I could tell he was holding himself back, waiting for me to signal. I tightened my grip on the flashlight in my hand. My other hand slid toward my phone on the table without breaking eye contact with the figure at the door. But before I could pick it up, the child moved. Not away, but closer. They pressed their hand flat against the glass. Small fingers, thin, trembling not from cold but from something else I couldn't name. Behind me, I heard the faintest crunch in the snow. The man had moved. Shadow's ears twitched toward the sound, but his body stayed fixed on the door. I turned my head just enough to catch sight through the front window. The man was closer now, halfway across the yard, walking slowly, deliberately, eyes fixed on the back of the house. The child's other hand rose to the glass, palms spread now, like they were asking to be let in. "No," I whispered, shaking my head instinctively, even though they couldn't hear me. Shadow's snarl deepened. He took one slow step forward, pressing his shoulder against my leg as if to push me back. That was when the child's mouth moved. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I could read them clear as day. "He knows where I sleep." A chill ran through me so sharp I almost dropped the flashlight. They stepped back from the glass just slightly, and in that same instant, the man's pace quickened outside. He wasn't running, not yet, but the steady, measured steps carried an intent that made my skin crawl. I grabbed the phone and hit the emergency number. My voice was low but urgent as I told the dispatcher, "There's a man and a child in my yard. They've approached my doors. I need someone here now." The dispatcher asked for a description, but before I could answer, the child was gone. 1 second they were there, the next they had melted into the dark, no sound, no movement I could track. The man had stopped again, closer than before, now just a few yards from the porch. His head tilted slightly, like he was listening for something. Shadow barked, once, sharp and loud, the sound echoing in the still air. The man straightened, turned, and walked back toward the trees without a word. By the time the deputies arrived, there was no sign of either of them. Just footprints in the snow, 2 sets leading to the back door, 1 to the front. I stood outside with the deputies, the cold biting at my face. One of them knelt by the back door, examining the small prints. "These are weird," he muttered. "No tread marks. No boots. Looks like bare feet." I blinked. Bare feet? In this weather? He nodded grimly. "Skin on snow." Shadow circled the yard, nose low, tracing the path the child had taken. He stopped at the edge of the trees and looked back at me, ears stiff, as if waiting for permission to keep going. I shook my head. Not tonight. After the deputies left, I double-locked both doors and shoved the kitchen table against the back one for good measure. Shadow lay by the front window again, his eyes scanning the yard, but I could tell he was uneasy in a way I hadn't seen before. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a sound I couldn't place. Not footsteps. Not knocking. Something else, a faint scraping. I eased out of bed and found Shadow standing in the hallway, ears pointed toward the back of the house. The sound came again, like nails on wood, slow and deliberate. When I reached the kitchen, I froze. The words "he knows where I sleep" were written in the frost on the outside of the back door's glass. I didn't move for several seconds, my breath fogging the inside of the glass while the words in the frost stared back at me. The way the letters curved, uneven and shaky, made it worse. This wasn't the quick scrawl of someone trying to scare me. This had been written slowly, with intention. Shadow stood rigid, his tail stiff, the low rumble in his chest so steady it felt like part of the room's background noise. I finally stepped closer, flashlight in hand, and shone the beam through the glass. The snow outside was marked with small, erratic footprints, the same bare ones the deputy had pointed out earlier, weaving back toward the tree line. There was no sign of the larger prints. Shadow's head jerked slightly toward the far edge of the yard. His body leaned forward in that subtle way that told me he was catching something, scent, sound, maybe both. I whispered, "Don't," but it was pointless. He trotted to the front door, pausing there as if waiting for me to follow. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed to stay inside, to wait for daylight, but there was something about the way he moved, deliberate, alert, almost certain, that told me he wasn't just reacting. He was tracking. I grabbed my coat from the hook, slipped into my boots, and opened the door. The cold slapped me instantly, but Shadow was already on the move, his paws crunching through the snow with a quiet efficiency. He didn't head straight to the tree line. Instead, he looped wide, as if trying to catch the scent from a different angle. His nose stayed low, his pace quickening with each step. The moonlight lit the snow enough that I didn't need the flashlight to see his path. Every so often, he'd stop, lift his head, and stare into the darkness ahead before lowering his muzzle again. We reached the point where the yard met the forest. Shadow paused here, scanning the shadows between the trees. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. A faint sound came from deeper inside, the quick, light patter of bare feet moving fast. Shadow took off. I followed, the cold biting at my lungs as we weaved through the trees. My flashlight beam swung wildly, catching flashes of frost-covered branches and dark shapes in the snow. And then, ahead, I saw movement, small, darting between the trunks. The child. Even in the poor light, I could see the outline of the oversized coat flapping with their stride, the thin legs moving fast, bare skin flashing pale in the moonlight. They didn't look back. Shadow didn't bark. He just ran, silent and focused, closing the gap. We broke into a small clearing, and the child suddenly stopped. They stood there, chest heaving, head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Shadow slowed but didn't stop, approaching with the same controlled precision I'd seen when he'd spotted the man in the yard. That's when the deeper voice came from the trees behind us. "You shouldn't have followed." I spun, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, and there he was. The man. He stood just inside the tree line, face now fully visible. The skin was weathered, the eyes sharp and cold, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Shadow shifted instantly, putting himself between me and the man, his head lowering, teeth flashing in the pale light. The man didn't flinch. "You think he's protecting you," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "He's not. He's keeping her from coming closer." I looked back toward the child. They were still standing in the same spot, watching. Their expression was unreadable. The man took one slow step forward, and Shadow barked, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. The child flinched, just slightly, and then turned, running into the darkness beyond the clearing. The man's eyes flicked toward where they'd gone, then back to me. "You'll see," he said, and stepped backward into the trees until the shadows swallowed him completely. For several seconds, I just stood there, my breath fogging the air, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. Shadow finally nudged my leg, breaking me out of it. He gave one last glance toward the direction the man had gone before guiding me back toward the house. When we stepped inside, the warmth of the air felt unreal. I locked both doors, checked every window, then collapsed into the armchair with Shadow at my feet. It was nearly dawn before I realized the frost on the back door was gone, melted away, but the faint outline of the words "he knows where I sleep" still lingered in my mind like a stain I couldn't scrub out. The sun had barely risen when I checked the yard again. The footprints from the night before were already softened by a thin layer of fresh snow, but I could still see them enough to know they were real, not something I imagined in the dark. The small, bare ones went deep into the trees. The larger set stopped abruptly in the middle of the clearing, almost like the man had vanished into thin air. Shadow didn't relax, even in daylight. He followed me through the house, his movements quieter than usual, eyes constantly flicking to the windows. Every time I passed the back door, his tail would stiffen, his gaze fixed on it as though expecting someone to be there. I brewed coffee just to keep my hands busy. My mind replayed every word, every glance, every strange detail from the night before. The way the man had spoken, not threatening, not begging, but certain, had lodged in my chest like a stone. By mid-morning, I called the sheriff again. They said they'd send a patrol by that evening, just in case. But even with that promise, the silence of the day felt heavy. Around 4 p.m., I noticed Shadow sitting at the front window again, the way he had the first night. His ears were forward, but his body was tense. I walked over, following his line of sight, nothing. Just snow and empty trees. Then I saw it. Far off, near the bend in the road, a small figure. Standing still. Watching the house. It was the child. No coat this time. Just the oversized wool hat and a faded dress that fluttered slightly in the wind. Bare legs. Bare feet on snow. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to open the camera. But the second I lifted it, the figure was gone. Shadow remained at the window for nearly an hour, his body angled toward that same spot. That night, I decided I wasn't going to sleep in my bedroom. I set up camp in the living room with the couch cushions on the floor, Shadow beside me. I kept the lights low, my coat and boots ready, just in case. It was close to midnight when I woke to the sound of tapping. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I sat up, heart pounding, scanning the dark room. Shadow was already standing, head turned toward the back of the house. The tapping came again. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the kitchen, Shadow pacing at my side. The tapping didn't stop, steady and unnerving. When I reached the back door, I froze. The child was there again, face close to the glass, breath fogging the pane. One hand rested against it, fingers spread. Her lips moved, slowly this time, like she wanted me to read them. "Let me in." Shadow pressed himself between me and the door, his growl low and constant. His body was so still it was almost unnatural, every muscle locked in place. I shook my head at her through the glass. She tilted her head, and for a moment, I could have sworn the corner of her mouth curled into the faintest smile. And then she mouthed something else. "He's already inside." A shiver went through me so hard my knees weakened. I spun, flashlight sweeping across the kitchen, empty. I moved into the hallway, the beam bouncing off picture frames, closed doors. Nothing. But Shadow didn't move from the back door. When I turned back, the girl was gone. The tapping had stopped, but the frost on the glass still held the shape of her hand. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Shadow lay at the window again until dawn, his gaze fixed outward, his breathing slow but heavy. By morning, new prints marked the snow behind the house. Small, bare feet circling, stopping at each window. And one larger set. Not many steps. Just enough to show that whoever it was had stood beneath my bedroom window for a long, long time. The patrol car rolled up just after dusk, headlights sweeping across the front yard in wide arcs. 2 deputies stepped out, Miller and Torres, both of whom I'd met during a break-in case last winter. They moved with a mix of alertness and casual familiarity, though their eyes scanned the treeline in a way that told me my earlier calls had gotten their attention. Shadow stayed at the front window, watching them approach. When I opened the door, he didn't move to greet them. Instead, his gaze kept shifting between the deputies and something deeper in the woods. Torres took the lead. "You've had a couple of strange nights, huh?" "You could say that." Miller glanced at the house, then back at me. "We'll hang around for a few hours, maybe do some sweeps. Any chance you'll let us put a couple of motion cameras around the property?" "Please." They walked the perimeter, setting up 2 small cameras at the front and back corners of the house. Shadow followed them halfway, then stopped, ears flicking toward the treeline again. He gave a short, sharp bark, not his warning bark, but the one he used when alerting me to something specific. Torres turned to me. "He's picking something up." I nodded. "He's been like that for days." When they finished, the deputies parked at the edge of the drive and kept their spotlight sweeping lazily across the yard every few minutes. For a while, it felt almost normal. Shadow curled on the floor beside me, the hum of the heater filling the quiet. But around 11 p.m., Shadow's head shot up. No growl. No bark. Just sudden, intense attention. I followed his gaze toward the front window. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, movement. A shadow slipped between 2 trees, moving in that slow, deliberate way I'd seen the man walk. I called Torres on the radio they'd given me. Front yard, left side, movement toward the house. Within seconds, both deputies were on foot, flashlights cutting through the dark. But the figure didn't retreat. Instead, it stopped just far enough from the light for me to see the outline, tall, still, watching. And then the girl appeared beside him. Bare feet. Thin dress. Head tilted in that unsettling way, like she was listening to something far off. The deputies moved in fast, but by the time they reached the spot, both figures were gone. No footprints. No broken branches. Miller came back shaking his head. "I swear they were right there." "How do you just vanish in fresh snow?" Torres said nothing, but his jaw was tight. They decided to circle the property again, this time walking slow and methodical. Shadow paced between each window, tracking them visually, tail low. It was close to midnight when they returned to their car. I watched from the living room as their headlights angled toward the road. They were leaving. I stepped outside before they could pull away. "That's it? You're just..." Miller cut me off gently. "We'll pass by again before morning, but we can't stay all night. You've got the cameras. If anything happens, call us." Shadow stood beside me, his breath fogging the air. I watched their taillights disappear down the road, the weight of the dark settling in around the house. We went back inside, locking up tight. Shadow returned to his place at the front window, but his attention shifted every few minutes to the back of the house. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A faint creak, like a floorboard bending under weight. Inside. I froze in the hallway. Shadow was already moving toward the sound, his head low, every step silent. We reached the guest room door. It was cracked open just slightly, a sliver of darkness showing inside. Shadow pushed it open with his nose. Empty. But the window was open. Snow had blown in, scattering across the floor, and in the middle of it, a single small footprint. Bare. Wet. I shut the window, locked it, then stood there for what felt like minutes, listening to the silence press in from every side. Shadow didn't leave my side the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn broke, I went to check the motion cameras. The front one had nothing but static for the hours between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. The back one had a single frame. The girl. Standing in the yard, looking straight at the lens. I didn't touch the guest room again that morning. Something about the footprint, the way it looked so fresh yet cold to the touch, made me want to close the door and forget it existed. But Shadow wouldn't let me. He kept circling back, nose low, as though checking to see if the scent had changed. By late afternoon, I decided to check the perimeter myself. The snow outside had been disturbed in small patches, most of them too vague to read. But behind the house, right under my bedroom window, I found something. A small, folded piece of paper. The edges were damp from the snow, but the handwriting inside was still legible, small, neat letters that didn't match the shakiness of the frost message. If he comes inside, I can't help you. My stomach tightened. I glanced toward the tree line, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. Nothing. When I brought the paper inside, Shadow immediately started sniffing it, his head tilting like he recognized the scent. Then, without warning, he growled, low, long, and unblinking, before padding to the back door and sitting there as if waiting for someone. I shut all the curtains before nightfall. This time, I didn't want to see out. It was just past midnight when the first knock came. Not a tap, a knock. 3 times. I froze on the couch, Shadow already on his feet, hackles raised. The sound had come from the side of the house, not the front or back door, but the wall where no door existed. The knock came again, this time lower, almost dragging along the siding. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly approached the source. Shadow stayed glued to my leg, his growl constant now. When I reached the wall, I realized the sound was traveling. It started at the far end, near the guest room, then moved toward the front of the house, steady and slow, like someone dragging their hand across the wood. And then it stopped, right outside the living room window. I lifted the curtain just an inch. The girl was there, her face inches from the glass, lips pale, eyes wide. Her breath made small bursts of fog against the cold pane. She didn't speak this time. She just raised her hand and pressed something to the glass. It was a small object, hard to see clearly in the dark, but I could tell it was metal. She let it rest there for several seconds before lowering it and placing it on the snow. Then she turned and walked toward the trees, her bare feet leaving perfect prints in the moonlit snow. I waited until she vanished into the shadows before unlocking the door and stepping outside. Shadow went straight to the object. A key. Old, heavy, brass. There was no tag, no marking, just a key. When I picked it up, the metal was warm. That was when I noticed something else, more prints, coming from the opposite direction of hers. Larger. Boot prints. They stopped exactly where she'd been standing, as if the person wearing them had been right there beside her. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Shadow sat at the front window, the key lying on the table beside me. Every time I looked at him, I saw the same tension in his body, the same steady watching. By dawn, I knew the key wasn't random. It was meant for something inside this house. The key sat on the table all morning, its dull brass catching just enough light to keep drawing my eye. I didn't touch it again, but Shadow kept circling back to sniff at it, his ears twitching as though some faint sound came from it. I kept asking myself the same questions. Why give it to me? What did she mean by if he comes inside, I can't help you? And what in this house would it open? By midday, I decided I couldn't just ignore it. I put on gloves and picked it up, its weight solid in my palm. The obvious places came first, the doors I didn't use, the padlock on the basement cabinet, the old storage trunks in the guest room closet. None of them fit. It was while I was in the hallway upstairs that Shadow stopped. Completely still. His gaze locked on the wall at the far end. It was the part of the house I'd always thought was just empty space, where the roof sloped down above the closets. But Shadow walked straight to the paneling and sniffed along the edge, then looked back at me. I knelt and ran my fingers along the seam. There was a tiny, almost invisible keyhole. My pulse quickened. I slid the brass key in. It turned smoothly, and a soft click echoed in the narrow hallway. The panel swung inward, revealing a low, narrow door no taller than my waist. Shadow went in first, his body disappearing into the darkness. I followed, crouching low, the air inside colder than the rest of the house. The space beyond was small, an unfinished attic crawl space, walls lined with rough wood. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. And in the far corner sat a single wooden chair. On it was a folded blanket. And beneath the blanket, a small metal tin. I hesitated, my breath clouding in the cold air, before pulling the tin toward me. The lid opened with a faint creak. Inside were photographs. Dozens of them, all black and white, some curling at the edges. The first one made my stomach drop. It was the girl, not as she looked now, but younger. Her hair shorter, her dress cleaner, her eyes less hollow. Photo after photo showed her in different places, a yard, a schoolroom, standing beside a man whose face was always partially turned away from the camera. Some of the photos had dates on the back, written in that same small, neat handwriting as the note. The earliest was from over 30 years ago. But the girl in the most recent picture, she looked exactly as she did now. My skin prickled. A faint scuffling sound made me turn. Shadow was at the opening of the crawl space, hackles raised, growl vibrating in his chest. I froze, listening. Soft, slow steps along the hallway outside. Then, a shadow passing in front of the thin line of light under the door. I shoved the tin into my coat, scooped up the blanket without thinking, and backed toward the small door. Shadow stayed between me and the exit until I slid through, shutting and locking the panel from the outside. The hallway was empty. I moved quickly back to the living room, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The blanket I carried was older than it had looked in the crawl space, faded, edges frayed. And it smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else I couldn't place. In one corner, embroidered in small, careful stitches, was a name. Her name. Shadow stayed close the rest of the day, his attention fixed on the upstairs hallway every time we passed it. That night, I put the photographs in a locked drawer and the blanket in my closet. The key stayed on the table. I told myself I wouldn't go back into that space again. But some part of me knew I would. That night, the house felt tighter somehow, as though the walls had drawn in, the air heavier. I'd locked every door, checked every window, and still Shadow wouldn't settle. He stayed in the living room, planted squarely in front of the big front window, body tense but quiet. Around 1 a.m., the wind shifted. I felt it before I heard it, that slight change in the way the trees swayed, the way the house's wooden frame gave soft little groans. Shadow's head snapped up, his ears forward. I turned off the lamp. For a long while, nothing happened. Just the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Then, faintly, a crunch. Footsteps on snow. Shadow rose, moving to the window without a sound. I followed, crouching low. At first, there was only darkness beyond the glass. Then a figure emerged from the tree-line. The man. He wasn't in the shadows this time. He walked with deliberate slowness, his coat brushing against his knees, his boots sinking deep into the snow. His face was pale in the moonlight, sharp lines, deep-set eyes that didn't move from the house. And then, from behind him, the girl stepped into view. She wasn't holding his hand, but she stayed close. Her head was turned toward him, like she was listening for his next word. When they reached the yard, she stopped. He kept walking until he was just beyond the edge of the porch light. Shadow's growl was low, almost a vibration in the air. The man raised his head and looked straight at the window. I didn't move. He lifted one gloved hand and pointed, not at me, not at the house, but toward the upstairs hallway. Then he turned and walked back toward the trees. The girl stayed where she was for a moment longer, her gaze meeting mine through the glass. She mouthed something, slow, deliberate words. "Don't open it." Then she turned and followed him into the darkness. I stood there for a long time after they'd vanished, the words still echoing in my mind. "Don't open it." When I finally moved, Shadow followed me up the stairs. We stopped at the end of the hallway, in front of the paneled door. I pressed my ear against it. Nothing. But then, faint, muffled, the sound of breathing. Not steady, restful breathing. Labored. Slow. I backed away, heart pounding. That night, Shadow refused to leave the hallway. I dragged a blanket up there and sat beside him, the key in my pocket. Every hour or so, I'd hear small noises from inside, a shift of weight, a creak of wood, that slow, deliberate breathing. The sky was just starting to lighten when the noises stopped. When I checked the panel, the keyhole was filled. Something had been jammed into it from the other side. I never opened it again. The deputies came back a few days later when I finally told them everything. They searched the crawl space but found it empty, no chair, no blanket, no tin of photographs. Just bare wood and dust. The cameras? Still nothing but static during the hours I'd seen them. Life returned to something like normal after that. But some nights, when the wind shifts and the trees go still, Shadow will leave his bed and walk slowly to the upstairs hallway. He'll sit there, ears forward, staring at that panel. And I know, even if I can't hear it, he's listening.